Hello, hello. Welcome in, everyone. So good to see you on this Thursday. My name is Jasmine. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the network weaver. I'll be co-hosting and just helping to facilitate us through some of these conversations today. Um, Very happy to have you all here. We're going to jump right into some of the content. I'm going to introduce my coworker and friend, Erin, who's going to start us in a good way.
Rich Jazz. Um, for any of us who've been traveling together through the emergence of the RAD Network, we've been guided by a lot of beautiful grandmothers, elders, and since the inception, we've always started off in a good way. And to make sure that we uphold the spirit of life at the center of our work as we continue to move through the changes together. So, Tanse Bojo, Gijagate Indigenous Cause, Nimki Benesse Dodem, Otopamiziwak Cree Métis Icelandic Isles Kwayandau, Benesi Okananising Donjaba. I am grateful that I was able to grow up. I mentioned Skeleton Lake, Flying Skeleton Bird Lake, about 2.5 hours north of Toronto in Anishinaabe speaking lands, in between the Williams and the Robinson Huron treaties. Today, I'm actually calling in from the homelands of one of my colleagues, Randy Russell. I'm calling in from the Banff Center on Sacred Guardian Buffalo Mountain. If you are familiar, it's the homelands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Ahe Nakota, and the Tsuut'ina, as well as Métis Region 3. And this area here, similar to Morley, Minith Pa and Minith Ni, are the people of the cold water, as well as the people of the waterfalls here in Banff. So I'm very grateful to receive the power of the land here, and we're at an Indigenous Women's Leadership Gathering. So it's quite an alignment when we talk about our traditional financial practices and really, truly taking care of the abundance of creation. And nurturing that and continuing to bring life forward in a good way collectively. And so we've had Elder Dyla Huel here speaking about those teachings from a Blackfoot perspective. And today, Elder Alice Kalkwitz, she's speaking a lot about Makusas and the warrior people, the warrior women, and the qualities of inter-reflection within our own personal being to continue to cultivate our leadership to bring things into light, from the shadow economy into the light together, and taking those wise practices and pathways. As a team, we've been doing a lot of work around bringing in traditional knowledge. And one this season around the turning of August was the shedding teachings, learning from all the serpents, all of the crustaceans around that cycle of shedding. We have so many different words now in systems transformation around that process of transition, tradition, transition, and transformation. So I just wanted to share a couple of rounds from the song from the spirit of our team here and from the lands and waters here. And just to give thanks for all of the deep work people are doing at this time towards our changes and to continuing to bring things into light and to restore our harmony. One of the teachings I had the opportunity to hear is that we restore our abundance when we reconnect to our sky realm and we complete that beautiful circle of who we are in creation, and abundance starts to flow. And so just restoring who we are at the center and living from abundance. And I can see Dr. Amy Cardinal's work around fire and centering abundance in the work that she's doing and really leading with that, especially during these times. We need it more than ever. So miigwech for the opportunity just to visit and to thank everyone. And I look forward to listening in and learning with everyone. And this song just means as I sit at the center of Mother Earth, I fly all around the sky world where I'm connected with all of creation.
Give it time.
Miigwech, everyone, for just listening to a few words before we dive into all the important work that's been happening. Thanks, Jazz.
Yeah, thank you very much for getting us started in a good way and just helping us to really focus our energy in today's conversation. I would also really like to thank all of the ENGOs who participated in the survey and the big lift that really was putting all this research together. Your time and your resources are going to allow us to ensure that the things that we're doing moving forward are grounded in the truth, really. So thank you to all those ENGOs who participated. Just before we dive like right into everything that is today, we just want to make sure that everyone knows what today's objectives are and kind of has a good sense of what the flow is going to be. So we're hoping here to share the high level overview of research findings on ENGO financial practices, to support participants to locate your organizational practices within the findings, to stimulate reflection on how to take this after our gathering. So how to, again, action these things, and how to share the ideas for next steps and what supports could be helpful moving forward. Well, I think with that, I will introduce EcoAnalytics and encourage them to introduce themselves as well. So take it away.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jim Boothroyd. I'm the project director of EcoAnalytics Research, and I'm coming to you today from the traditional unceded Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam peoples, also known as Vancouver, or specifically Vancouver within those territories. EcoAnalytics is a nonprofit market research project on the shared platform of Makeway that strengthens the voices of all those who protect the environment by helping communicators understand their audiences and engage them more effectively. So we share all of our research and guidance on our searchable database at our website, and I'll put the link to that in the chat after I finish. Here at our website, which is ecoanalyticscanada.org, you can also join our mail list and stay on the leading edge of environmental opinion research. We're supported by member subscribers. Those are nonprofit groups across the country like Ecology Action Centre in the Maritimes, Environmental Defence in WWF in Ontario, Pembina and ReClimate based in Alberta, and West Coast Environmental Law, David Suzuki Foundation, and Organizing for Change in BC, among others. And we also, the rest of our funding comes from generous family foundations, ECHO, North, Sitka, and Roadberg. Since 2016, we've done a lot of surveys and focus groups. You may have heard of the personas of new population segments in the movable middle that we have revealed, the so-called 5 Canadas of climate change. Groups are using research like this to connect with tens of thousands of new potential supporters, people who may not consider themselves to be environmentalists. The financial practices research we're discussing today, however, is a first thing for us. It's the first organizational study we've done, one that calls for a lot of trust and sensitivity. So we're very grateful to the 2 Indigenous-led agencies that have trusted us as collaborators here. First off, the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership based at the University of Guelph, which got the ball rolling. In particular, we'd like to thank Alison Bishop and Robin Roth, who were first to connect with us and come up with the idea for this, the concept for this research. And then above all, I'd like to thank the RAD Network, chief among them, Darcy Riddell and Chelsea Martin, who unfortunately can't be with us today, who have refined the study and collaborated with us over months to bring it this far. And with the help of Environics research as well, most notably Annika Jagmohan and Sarah Robertson. Finally, I'd also like to throw a thanks to Kate McMahon, the EcoAnalytics project manager who has led EcoAnalytics work in this important study. We trust that you find the results useful. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to give a moment for Environics to also introduce themselves. Take it away.
Hi everyone, my name is Anika and I'm a research associate at Environics Research. I'm joining you guys from Toronto, which is traditionally territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee. And Environics is a Canadian market research and consulting firm. We work across a variety of different sectors, including environmental research and a lot of research in the public sector with NGOs as well. As a non-Indigenous firm, our journey to Indigenous allyship is long and ongoing, but our philosophy is that partnerships really are key to success. So we've invested in developing long-term and respectful relationships with our Indigenous clients and consultants as well. And we are very grateful to our partners who advise us along the way. Excited to be here today, and thanks for letting us be part of this project. I will pass it back to RAD.
Okay, and I'm gonna encourage Darcy now to say a couple of words about RAD.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. This is such an interesting piece of research, and hoping that we really get a chance to open up some conversation with you all. So I work with the RAD Network, Restore, Assert, Defend, and we were formed out of the Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership and some other conversations that we're really looking at how do we finance Indigenous-led conservation, stewardship, and land back and land use visions. So we, our network has emerged over the last few years, and we have an Indigenous governance group, and our staff team are a combination of Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks. And so this felt like a really perfect piece of research for us to contribute to. We're also hosting a learning and knowledge hub on Indigenous-led natural climate solutions for the next 4 more years. That's funded through ECCC. So we're really at the crux of these kind of conversations about how to decolonize finance and understanding that our unsustainable economy is driving biodiversity loss, but it's also benefited from a history of land injustice, land theft, and ongoing ignoring or lack of understanding of the role that jurisdiction and Indigenous nations need to play in decision making. And I come to this work through a history of having worked in the environmental movement and environmental and social philanthropy, and calling in from Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh territories, and just feel like it's a great opportunity for us to try to get under the hood. And so can go to the next slide here. Just really, it was interesting because we had to actually define what we meant by financial practices. There's been a lot of work, and here's just a snapshot of a few previous literatures that we reviewed and in locating this work, and really want to honor and hold our hands up to the work that's already been happening. A lot of it is focused on environmental philanthropy. And we also know that a lot of ENGOs in their best practices, don't want to be intermediaries around funding and think that understand that direct funding to Indigenous peoples is a priority and a preferred way of funding. However, large ENGOs are often in the position of intermediary with Indigenous peoples, and there's a lot of useful work that has already been done to kind of lay out thinking the priorities of Indigenous peoples, both globally and increasingly in Canada. So we just wanted to highlight this work from the Indian Treaty Council, which really looked at how to create rights-based principles for ethical engagement of conservation funders and intermediaries, the core human rights principles for private conservation organizations through the UN, which was worked on by many global leaders, including David Boyd, who comes out of our movement in Canada here. And then really honoring some of the work that's being done with Indigenous partnership the upwelling learning agenda that was advanced through the Circle and Environment Funders Canada. Really encourage folks to take a look at what's in there. The top resource is just a page out of work that had been done that lives on the IPCA knowledge basket that came out of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership that's looking at sort of colonial funding practices, both the thorns and the fruits, so positives and barriers and challenges. And then the work of the Right Relations Collaborative. They've been pushing the envelope on philanthropic relationships and flipping the script so that funders apply to the Council of Aunties to receive approval to be able to fund through a relationship building exercise. So there are a lot of resources out there. We're not starting from scratch on this. However, to our knowledge, this is one of the first efforts to really specify the kinds of practices financially that ENGOs are involved with and pull the curtain back a little bit on that, and then also create an opportunity for some of the really cool innovations that many of your organizations are doing and ways that you're pushing your practice so that we can share that and quicken the pace of change. Next slide. So just quickly, some of the themes that are in the existing literature are, as I mentioned, direct funding is preferred with long-term flexible approaches, and that's more on the philanthropic side of things, but also thinking about things like long-term conservation finance funds that are established, that are Indigenous led. Then issues around transparency and accountability, and obviously they're different globally. Where a lot of land defenders are actively threatened with their lives. In Canada, fortunately, we have a little bit less of that, but there's still a real lack of safety around some of the human rights issues, but also just starting to be comfortable disclosing financial practices and fundraising practices that ENGOs are doing in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. Moving towards more disclosure, we think would be a positive. And all of these links will be provided when we send back out the slides to folks who attended. Deepening partnerships. So we're going to take a look at some contract and agreement templates or findings that we found for folks, because what's in contracts is really important, and how organizations work with embedding things like FPIC and are dealing with relationship building and uplifting Indigenous governance and recognizing Indigenous nationhood. And then finally, this work isn't just about individual economic practices and financial practices. It's really a lot of the pointing out when Indigenous peoples are engaged to discuss financial practices, it goes to the deeper lack of sustainability of our overall economy. And that's a much more thorny issue in terms of, we know that that's the driver of conservation losses and biodiversity loss. And there's a real need to look at how decision-making and how power is shifted, not just because it's a justice issue, but because it's also inequitable systems of wealth are also what's driving biodiversity loss. And so starting to think about these things systemically is always been prioritized in a lot of the work that's already been done, and we hope to continue that conversation. And so we put together sort of somewhat of a high-level depiction of financial practices, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but you can review it, and we'll be diving into the details. Anika's going to walk us through the key findings that we're bringing to you today.
So yeah, we wanted to start this project by grounding ourselves in what's already known on the topic. So Darcy shared a bit of the sources that we used. Our first step was conducting a gray literature review. So we reviewed existing articles, reports, and Indigenous-led guidance on the topic. You can see the list on the side there. We then collaborated with EcoAnalytics and RAD to create a reflexive survey. So the organizations who volunteered to participate in this initiative took a few months to gather their information. So they told us about their partnerships, their funding practices, barriers, And this was called a reflexive survey because it was not very quantitative in nature. It was really meant to be more of a guide to spark reflexive conversations among participants. And we had about 10 organizations participating, and it ranged from small organizations to large national ones. And their responses really gave us a picture of where each organization is in their journey to better supporting Indigenous nations financially. And so after reading through their responses, which huge thank you to them for that, they provided so much detail, and learning about their journeys, we hosted a focus group with representatives from 7 of those organizations to deepen our findings. So at each stage of the project, our analysis has been qualitative. We really are just learning about each of the ENGOs experiences and then identifying common themes, practices, and challenges. So we use more of a what we heard approach when reporting back to the project team at different stages. So really just emphasizing those participant quotes as opposed to hard coding responses to fit them into specific themes or categories and things like that. So with that, let's get into what we learned from all these activities. So the first key finding is that Indigenous partnerships are increasingly important. So all ENGOs who participated are very clearly committed to reconciliation and supporting Indigenous-led conservation. And we see this in the language they use. It's often very respectful and appropriate. For example, most organizations recognize Indigenous nations as governments and mentioned the importance of their role and the knowledge in environmental conservation. So it's really the tone that Indigenous people are not just another stakeholder, so really acknowledging the unique role and responsibility there. We also see that there has been decades of support, collaboration, and longstanding partnerships with Indigenous nations. So it's not just commitments on paper, but ENGOs are putting in the work, and they have been putting in the work to actually build some really strong longstanding relationships. And reading their mission statements, all mention the unique and important role of Indigenous people, but the level of centrality that we saw varied. So there were a few organizations that recognize Indigenous rights and involvement as central to carrying out their core mission, but we see that organizations have been working towards increasing their support and partnership. So the responses that we got also gave the sense that most ENGOs are relatively early in systemizing practices for financial support compared to the budget. So some do have formal practices that extend across the organization, and others are still figuring out how to decolonize their financial practices. And in terms of like how much is allocated, the percentage of total program budgets allocated to Indigenous-led efforts wasn't always an easy number to find or quantify. And the estimates that we got kind of had a big range, ranging from like 0% to 50% or more. So part of that is also the nature of it's just unclear how to track. But overall, there are lots of examples of new and emerging practices for better supporting Indigenous nations financially. And so our next few findings will provide a little bit more detail in all of that. So the next finding is about leadership integration. Our finding is that leadership integration could benefit from a greater focus. So we asked ENGOs about the amount of Indigenous staff and their use of Indigenous advisory to understand the level of guidance that Indigenous leadership has. So the ways ENGOs incorporate Indigenous engagement and leadership falls on a spectrum from least formal to most formal. So least formal is there on the left, that's ad hoc Indigenous advisors, which is really just contracting external Indigenous advisors or consultants on an as-needed basis. So it could be for specific projects or initiatives or just things like that. It could be one-off or it could be recurring. And we found that all organizations that participated are doing this. The next in the spectrum is Indigenous advisory councils or board participation. This is a little bit more formal than ad hoc just because it's part of the governance structure. So council or the boards meet regularly or as needed to provide input on specific initiatives or strategic direction. So most organizations are doing this. It's just that the level of formality varies, and so does the frequency of the meetings. So a few said that their councils don't meet as often as they'd like to. And moving along to the orange, third is having full-time Indigenous staff. So this is when there are dedicated internal roles meant for Indigenous people. So the purpose or the objectives of these roles can vary. So some do involve influencing strategic direction of the organization, and a few are doing this, but they mention having some challenges with sometimes finding Indigenous applicants, as well as retention and actually keeping Indigenous staff in their roles. And that brings us to the fourth and most formal, which is the Integrated Indigenous Unit. So this is a unit comprised of ENGO staff who advise the board and have a large influence on the strategic direction of the organization. And this was the least common, but really a structure that organizations who have the capacity can be working towards, because in a structure like this, Indigenous guidance really is like the guiding star that has implications for pretty much all aspects of the organization. So the next finding is about how ENGOs support their Indigenous partners. So we found that in-kind support is core, but slowly evolving more into increasing capacity. So we asked ENGOs how they support their Indigenous partners, and the most common way was definitely in-kind support. So directly providing support and services to Indigenous partners free of charge. So some common examples were proposal and grant writing, legal services, technical support, and you can see the list there. The way that these services are funded varies. So what some ENGOs do is they raise their own funds to be able to provide those services free of charge, or sometimes they actually work with Indigenous partners themselves to help them access funds for the services. But there's a couple ways that ENGOs are trying to increase capacity or give their partners more control. So for example, with grant writing, instead of just writing the grants for them, some ENGOs are making connections and helping their partners facilitate relationships directly with the funders. Another practice that stands out is doing joint applications, or even adding a line item that lets ENGOs re-grant funds directly to Indigenous partners. So that way they don't have to do a whole separate grant on their behalf. So with that, I will pass it to Darcy for a reflection pause.
Thanks, Anika. And it was really great to kind of sift through the findings and then also have a focus group with many of the participating ENGOs. And as we were looking at it, we really started to reflect on, where there are advisors, how could reciprocity be really deepened with those advisors, that there's still a risk of that feeling quite transactional, or ENGOs centering the mission that they have and then bringing advisors on to sort of help it advance. And so what does it mean to sort of decenter those relationships? And really thinking about, we heard in the findings that for Indigenous staff of ENGOs, that those can be really challenging roles for Indigenous people. And so thinking about what do the long-term, what can that look like in terms of embedding staff in community? So we have heard, that when we know that some ENGOs are basically just acting almost as a fiscal agent to host a staff person that's actually embedded in community, like might be working on an IPCA or something like that. And so, or technical and mapping work, but hired by the ENGO at the request of a nation because they don't want to have to administer that person and they don't have the funds for it. So thinking about some of the different roles, and there's a real sense, like looking at the number of you all on this call, that there are probably some really interesting innovations that we could do more to surface and share around that. But I think in terms of these roles, especially what we found with this idea of the Indigenous pillar, which was the only example we saw in the findings, where it's really like this firewalled Indigenous led space. And that seemed like a really interesting model that folks could learn more about, that organizations could consider in terms of offering long-term support. So thanks Sam White-Eye and Caroline in Canada for sharing that model with us. And we think that it's a really powerful way of thinking about that group of Indigenous staff that have come through there, and then that it's basically a firewalled entity that could spin off or and has its own data, which you'll look at a little bit further in the findings. But with all of this work around in-kind supports, a lot of that we know is very time sensitive, and it's sort of like it's filling a need, and it's often short-term needs. So what does it actually look like for, you know, the environmental philanthropy and ENGO community looking forward to, if we know that Indigenous-led conservation is the pathway to 30 by 30, and we know that deepening stewardship capacities, you know, beyond land guardians, really having the technical competencies, the embedded capacity in community to be able to steward land, but also go through all the policy and legal components of acquiring land back, either through tenure and management changes, conservation designations, or private land acquisitions, that there's a huge gap in the capacity. And so in the short term, ENGOs providing ad hoc supports is a positive thing, but how can we actually almost do some future work to envision what happens where all that money and that time investment stops being held, and staffing stops being held within ENGOs and is actually being actively moved into community. So that's a question that we're really holding. How, and then, you know, the kind of details around those questions to help them be more specific are, what are the kinds of nation building and economy building activities that First Nations and Indigenous communities are involved with? How can youth be trained or brought along so that those capacities aren't continuing to be held within ENGOs in more power imbalanced kind of ways? And then also, what types of new infrastructures can really be left behind as legacies within communities where there is a lot of collaboration happening? So these are the kinds of questions that we're hoping to lean into further, and here also have you speak to each other about how you're thinking about that. Go ahead, Anika.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely lots to think about when we're thinking about how to transition from some short-term perspectives to long-term perspectives. We also wanted to take a look at the different types of agreements that are used when working with Indigenous partners. And so what we found is that since the organizations work with Indigenous partners in a variety of different ways, they also use a variety of different agreements. So it's pretty flexible depending on the needs or the objectives at hand. So sometimes informal agreements are used. So that could be like a handshake or a verbal agreement without any sort of formal written document. And we've seen that that could be used for in-kind support, for honoraria, or just general collaboration. Formal agreements are also used. So those are the written contracts. They could be short or long-term or even renewable. And we saw them being used for in-kind services, but also for direct funding, things like hiring staff, providing grants, land acquisition, or contracting knowledge keepers, trainers, facilitators, things like that. But generally speaking, there was also some common challenges, especially with the formal agreements. So the first is the colonial structures and the requirements. So sometimes those requirements come from the government, from the CRA. And so ENGOs are working with Indigenous partners to rewrite formal agreements to better support Indigenous leadership and shift away from that colonial lens. The other challenge is the administrative burden of those requirements, and that can sometimes serve as a real barrier to sharing the funding. So one example that was mentioned is the lack of MOUs, which is Memorandum of Understanding. And so that's kind of like these contracts that Indigenous people need to have. It's a requirement they need to be able to meet in order to actually receive funding from the NGO. So now let's look a little bit at how ENGOs are trying to overcome those challenges. So one method is co-creating agreements with Indigenous partners, and we've seen that that tends to work quite well. We have a quote below on that process with an ENGO saying that they start off by including their values and the ways that they want to work together up front. So that creates a more relational way of starting the process and paves the way for co-creation. So they usually start by sharing a template, and that template is what gets edited and revised, and it usually takes a couple sessions of co-creating the agreements together. And this is great because Indigenous partners have a say in the terms and agreements, but the challenge there is that they might not always have the time or the capacity to participate in a process like this, especially with like multiple rounds. So another practice that we've seen is really like tweaking the templates themselves and making it mandatory to include OCAP principles, so the First Nation principles of ownership, control, access, and possession in agreements, as a way to decolonize the language that's used in those agreements. So we have a quote here also showing how one ENGO worked with a lawyer from one of their Indigenous partners to revamp their templates so that it's more inclusive language, and that inclusive language is now the standard across the organization. So they say they're less legalese, things to just make it more inclusive. So another topic that we covered is intellectual property. So protecting Indigenous knowledge and IP is really important. And so we asked participants how this is approached at their organizations, and they shared a couple methods. So first is they will require written consent to use Indigenous IP. The second, Darcy touched on, which is using firewall protection for Indigenous knowledge so that the data is protected on the servers and only those with permission can actually access the information. So even if you're in the organization, but you don't have permission, you won't be able to access it. And third is including Indigenous data sovereignty in policies and processes. So this is really just revising the general data and privacy policies, as well as how they're implemented across the organization to better support Indigenous data sovereignty. One organization says that they have a group that is explicitly focused on that. So that's another example of how that's being approached. And following this topic of data privacy, we also wanted to talk about transparency. So something that stood out in the literature review was the importance of transparency. Some sources identified transparency as a crucial practice for building trust and ensuring that financial practices include Indigenous leadership. And one of the sources identified transparency around funding for Indigenous-led initiatives as a gap, so just an area that needs improvement. So globally, 62% of Indigenous people report not being informed of the sources of funding for projects or activities that are brought onto their land. So really that shows there's an appetite for this information about where the funds are coming from, but it's not always met. So in our survey, we asked whether ENGOs share information about the source or the total amount of funding that they have with their Indigenous partners. The organizations provided tons of information. It was a very long survey, but when it came to the transparency section, we got a little bit less there compared to some of the other sections that were very, very well responded, for example, like partnerships and support. So some organizations are proactive in sharing this information, especially with new partners, because they want to create realistic expectations. They noted that sometimes people think they have way more funding than they actually do, so it's really beneficial on both ends to be transparent about what funding is actually available. However, it doesn't seem like that is always a common practice, and so that's something to continue working on improving. So I've thrown a lot of information at you, so we're just gonna summarize quickly. What we found overall is that environmental organizations are genuinely committed to reconciliation and to supporting Indigenous-led conservation, but they're at different stages in developing their practices. So some are engaging Indigenous people as advisors, board members, or staff, but very few have fully integrated Indigenous units. So there's recognition that more needs to be done to really embed Indigenous leadership into organizational governance and decision-making. We also found that in-kind support is the most common way ENGOs support. It's important, but many groups are now thinking about how to move from direct service provision towards approaches that also increase Indigenous capacity in the long term. On agreements and intellectual property, we're seeing a shift away from colonial top-down contracts towards more co-created agreements. And many organizations are starting to adopt OCAP principles and put in safeguards in place to protect Indigenous knowledge, which is great to see. And finally, transparency. Sharing information about funding sources and amounts is critical for building trust, but current practices are a bit inconsistent. So some groups are proactive while others are less clear. So this is an opportunity for improvement across the sector. But together, these findings show that ENGOs are moving in the right direction. There's still more work to do to better align financial practices more fully with commitments to Indigenous-led conservation. So with that, we can open it up to questions or check in a little bit with you guys.
Yeah, so I'll read out the question. So the question reads, everyone on the call probably agrees on the need for OCAP principles and co-ownership, but how do we persuade less convinced decision makers and ENGOs who worry about CRA, etc.? So I'll pass that to whoever on the team feels most confident answering that question.
Aha, these are philosophical and policy and practice questions. I think it's a really important one. I think there are lots of ways around it. There are lots of ENGOs who are producing it. It has to do at the root with probably some more decolonizing work that has to happen at the leadership and board levels. We really did find, and I'm sure most of you have been in positions where you see that folks on the front lines who are engaged in relationship building want to make this work and want to find ways to reduce the barriers of kind of colonial entanglements, and that oftentimes that the challenge is that they're actually trying to work around their own administrative functions. The larger the organization, one might be able to generalize, the tougher that might be. And so, so depending on your organization, it's going to look different in terms of how you foster your own decolonizing practices. So that's sort of, you could try to do a learning exchange with other organizations who are leading practices. And also, I think we're in a time now where there is increased recognition. For example, I was just working on the IPAS Transformative Change Assessment, which is the global assessment on ecosystem services and biodiversity. And the whole thing is framed around that we have to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, which are inequitable systems of wealth, disconnections between humans and nature, and basically the capitalist economy. And so we can't avoid those conversations anymore, that the practices that are directly implicated and carrying forward those colonial structures are actually part of the problem. And so there's ways to build arguments, and then I think creating safe spaces to actually just work through. And so there's that deeper learning and the bigger picture, and then there's the very applied practical learning. And so we are also interested in creating spaces for people to share very practically what they're interested in, like what they're doing. And we recognize that siloing is part of the problem, because organizations might be really innovating in one area, and then other organizations could really benefit from learning about that. But of course, some of that is in contractual and privacy focused spaces. So we're interested in having more discussions about how we might be able to foster that happening in a safe space, because so much of these things otherwise remain under wraps in terms of business and legal documentation that isn't understood to be able to be shared.
I see we have another question in the chat as well from Agatha, which is Agatha recently completed OCAP training and worked on incorporating the principles into a user agreement, though they're not sure how well they managed to incorporate them. Any suggestions on how to make sure that the principles are indeed embedded in the contract? This actually is like a theme that did come up in our survey findings as well. So lots of organizations are doing Indigenous training, including OCAP training. We found it was more common for organizations where the training was mandatory across the organization, that they were able to start figuring out how to implement it and know, what's working, what's not. And the reason for that is because it seems like integrating or aligning these financial practices can be a very cross-functional initiative. It requires a lot of communication across different departments, different teams, or just even people with different roles. So doing it on your own and trying to figure it out can be quite a challenge. But somehow, yes, I see your hand is up, Agatha. Go for it.
Oh, sorry, finish answering the
No,
question.
go ahead.
I can then speak after you.
No, just that it's found better results when more members of the organization completed the training, and that when it's taken as a cross-functional initiative. So go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, we are a relatively small organization, and so far it's only been me completing the training. And I ran this user agreement past lands director at one of the First Nations I've been speaking to, just to get some feedback. And my sense is that I probably need to run it past more people who we would be potentially working with at the same time. I'm just very conscious of capacity issues and who's got time to read 11 pages of a user agreement for some random organization. So it might be that it will be the partners that we will be working with. We might just ask them for some input with the existing agreement as it is. But yeah, any other suggestions? I just found it really hard to translate the knowledge that I gained from the training into the contract, and I don't feel equipped to really judge if I did a good job or not of really incorporating those principles. Thank you.
For sure. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, it's important to kind of know how those changes are working out, if it's having the outcomes that you actually want to be seeing. I'm just reminded of that quote that we saw from one of the organizations that worked with one of the Indigenous partners' lawyers, or maybe even having a consultant to kind of help get more opinions. I don't know if that's something that's feasible or you'd be interested in, but just as you were talking, I was reminded of that example.
Yeah, I like the idea of maybe finding a lawyer. If one of the partners has a lawyer that we could work with, that could be a solution. I like that. Thank you.
And that's a great idea from Ian about trying to include some anonymized examples. I don't know that we'll have the bandwidth to do that for the first report. We are going to create some type of a checklist and a dialogue starter, but that's something that might actually be better shared within sort of also like a trusting, like a community of practice space or something. So we can think about that more and see what we could offer. So good to see everybody's faces. Also just like a real appreciation to everyone who's here. This is a really well attended session, and it speaks to how passionate people are about growing in these areas. And I think I'm interested to know it might speak to an untapped need for that type of practical sharing. So we really encourage you to share in the chats if you have key the things you see that you'd like to see going forward around this. Like I'm already sort of thinking this probably warrants a community of practice or some type of very practical sharing space that's safe and can quicken the pace of change. Yeah, we, in the thinking around this, we really just invite everybody to consider there's so much good work happening, but a lot of it still is contained within the body of environmental organizations, the capacities. And sometimes that's what nations want, it really differs. And, but how can you deepen your partnerships so that you're actually inquiring about the broader economic and capacity development needs that nations have, because, and increasingly start to see not as a kind of conservation only relationship, but that Indigenous community well-being and economic thriving and abundance is part of the necessary pathway for our environmental work as well. And so what does that actually mean when you start to take that seriously? How do you think about, or can you think about together with your partners, how do we move in these new ways together and build stronger economies through this work? And the other thing is ENGOs have a tremendous access to other networks that partners don't have. I'm sure that many of you have encountered that, and you're already doing that type of introduction work, connection with experts, and just getting out of the way, but supporting through introducing and connecting nations and communities to new capacities. And so really thinking about that, like what what things do you take for granted as an organization that you have in terms of abundance that might be really valuable to community? And again, a lot of that comes through the deepening of relationship, and that has to do with being present in the communities and really attuning to the broader pieces, because we all know that communities are subject to this incredibly siloed transactional funding environment through government silos across different levels, right? And so many people are constantly going to nations with a very narrow opportunity as opposed to honoring the holism of this work. And so in what way can your organization continue to deepen into that? And how do we really, what does it mean to, continue this shift that's happening in the environmental movement and community in Canada and beyond, where Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous leadership, and recognition of nationhood is at the center, where land justice is at the center, and where the need to build Indigenous economies are at the center? How can our organizations lean more and more into that? And then something really specific, we do know that the amount of in-kind and other supports that we're talking about are actually dwarfed by the amount of money that goes into the acquisition of private lands, and that First Nations and Indigenous communities have deep interests in that. And so we'd like to do another part of work where we really focus specifically on private lands. And we know there's a lot of good work to build on there too, with the land trust organizations, and recognizing many of you are here. So that's just some nuggets about going forward. Over back to you, Jazz.
Thank you so much, Darcy. And part of moving forward is ensuring that you folks know when you are doing this work and you're doing the reflections and bringing it back to your organizations, that there are supports and tools and resource kits out there for you. So even from just this presentation, like, there will be a full report coming that we will let you know is coming out and give you access to. Within RAD specific supports, we do have an upcoming reading circle that we're super excited to be hosting. It's about unlearning Canada. Future one is going to be potentially about financial practices. Got a little ahead of myself. And you can find out more about that either through our social media, through our website, through our newsletter. If you haven't signed up, I would recommend signing up. And if you want to just wait until you get a follow-up email to get all this information, you're more than welcome to wait for that follow-up email. There's also the Indigenous Engagement Institute. So Gwen Bridge is an incredible person. I highly recommend following her work, as is James Radling, a Leaf Senior. Again, we're going to be sending all these links out for you folks to engage with and to use as needed. There's the Indigenous Economic Futures Symposium, or conference, I should say, in San Francisco, November 4th to 6th. From what I've seen and what I've read, that looks like it's going to be an amazing time to ask some incredible questions, but also just to learn and to connect with like-minded people. So if you are free during that time, I highly recommend looking into potentially going. And then, of course, I already plugged our newsletter, but we'll be sending some information on how you can engage with that, some webinars, upcoming full moons, and then seasonal gatherings as well. And then last is just a reminder that we have a bunch of things planned and ready to go for you folks now. But as we move forward, as we hear back from you, as we even go through the notes from today, we're going to have even more resources and tools for you. We hope you got something fruitful out of it. I know even just from our conversation, we had a lot of really great ideas, and we're excited to see what you folks kind of motion forward and like build from this. So thank you so much for joining. We'll stay in touch and keep doing all the great work that you're already doing. Thank you.